welcome to today's session of the Open UK Future Founders Training. This is session number 5. We're going to be talking about how open source businesses can generate revenue. And I've got an amazing panel, but before I introduce them, let me just say a few words about this overall series that's been put together primarily by Matt Bates, who's the founder in residence, entrepreneur in residence at Open UK. He's been putting together an amazing series of training sessions like this one, covering all sorts of aspects of how to found and run a business based on open source. This is being put together by Open UK. I hope you've all already come across Open UK, but it's an organisation based here in the United Kingdom, driving leadership and collaboration in open technology, whether that's open source, open data, open hardware. We're interested in all those areas. So although we're focused on the UK, we're also very interested in collaborating with people from around the world. You can find us on social media, you can find us on LinkedIn, and I think May has been posting some useful links, places where you can find us and places where you can sign up for more information. So as I say, this is the 5th session of a series of 10. The first 9 are online like this one. The 10th one's actually going to be a live pitching event. So if you are a founder of an open source related business and you'd be interested in pitching at that event, do get in touch. We're interested in finding more people to join, both on the mentoring side and on the founder mentoree side. And we hope we can match founders and businesses to some really great expertise based in this country. All right, so I think it is now time for me to introduce our amazing panel. I'm just going to go around our panel and give them a minute or so to introduce themselves and talk about why they're interested in open source and open source businesses. So let me start with Dawn Foster, who is Director of Open Source Community Strategy at VMware. Hi, Dawn.
Liz. So I'm Dawn Foster. I work at VMware in our open source program office. I've been working in open source for more than 20 years, and I first started by getting fascinated by how these communities of people get together and do productive work without necessarily having a company or an organization around them. And I found that really, really interesting. And so I started getting more and more involved in open source. And I care deeply about the open source business models and how people make money out of open source, because I enjoy working on open source full time. And I really like that I can work for companies like VMware who can pay me to do that full time.
Wonderful. Next up is Lorna Mitchell, who is Head of Developer Relations at Ivan.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, I'm Lorna. My background is software development. So I've come across open source as an engineer, as someone who builds the technology and uses all of the open source tooling. Now I'm with Ivan. We're a startup scale up working with open source databases. So I'm still getting to do a lot of work with the open source community. And I'm really interested in seeing how our business and other businesses can really thrive in the open source ecosystem.
Next, I'd like to introduce Amanda Brock, who is the CEO of Open UK. Hi, Amanda.
Thanks, Liz. And I should start by saying what an honour it is to be invited onto one of these panels. This is very much not something that I've been organising. As Liz said, Matt Barker, our entrepreneur in residence, and the Founders Forum, which Liz is also on, have been organising these sessions. So I'm quite honoured and privileged to be on one. I'm CEO at Open UK. I'm a lawyer by background. I spent 25 years working as a lawyer, which I think is long enough for anybody. 5 of those were in Canonical, the open source company, and I got involved in open source in 2008. My particular interest around commercial models, I suppose, comes from back then and doing sort of deals around open source and having worked on so many of them over sort of a 5 to 10 year period. But also, I've just written a book chapter in a book that will be published towards the summer, Free and Open Source Software, Law, Policy and Practice, which is being published by Oxford University Press, But the really exciting thing is it's open access and it has 20 odd authors participating in it. So it'll be a great tool, I hope.
Wonderful. So it's great to have the three of you join me. I should probably also just introduce myself as well. My name is Liz Rice. I'm the Chief Open Source Officer at Isovalent, which is a business that founded on an open source project called Cilium. And I've also been very involved in the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, where I've had the privilege to see a lot of different businesses, a lot of different organizations of, from individuals right up to huge multinational corporations who are basing their businesses around open technology. So it's been really fascinating to see how that ecosystem has been successful and a lot of the different ways that people are basing those businesses around open source. And I think maybe if we start off with this fact that, commercial companies really are getting involved in open source, and it's commercial companies that fund open source. And maybe Dawn, do you want to speak a bit to that? Because VMware is a huge company and very much involved in the open source community.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that I've been fascinated about for a pretty long time. I did a PhD and I studied the Linux kernel, and I was kind of looking at corporate participation in the Linux kernel in particular. And it's something I started thinking a lot about when I worked at Intel years ago, because we had so many people who were contributing to full-time to open source projects along with our competitors. And I really see this shift from, we used to think of open source as being mostly developed by hobbyists and people who are doing it in their spare time. But I think one of the things that's really helped open source be so successful and so ubiquitous is that companies are now paying people full-time to do this work, which means that we have a lot more time to actually contribute to these open source projects than we might have if we were trying to do it evenings and weekends. So I think it's something, this corporate participation in open source is one of the things that's, I think, really accelerated the ecosystem.
Lorna, would you like to jump in?
I think, a lot of open source is built on contributions from people at work, and it's really important that we recognize that it is like Dawn says, it's not the hobbyist thing. It's something where it is important, it supports businesses, and I think there's also more of a move now to formalizing us having contributors in the workplace, both in terms of the having the policies in place to allow people to contribute, but also in organizations having open source program offices, you'll hear us say OSPO, where people focus entirely on open source.
So why do we think these companies are contributing to open source? Is it charity? What do we think?
Will I jump in?
Who wants to jump in? Yeah,
I'll jump in on that. So I think when we were talking about this the other day, I quoted Matt Acey, one of the open source pundits who you'll see writing everywhere. And Matt says that companies that contribute to open source are selfish. And I don't think they are. I think they're smart. I think they're doing the right thing. And I think they're building the best software, the best tooling, and they know what they're doing. But of course, they're also doing what makes business sense. So undoubtedly for companies who are users and contributors, whether they build their whole business on open source or not, or they're trying to build a business model around open source is another thing, it's smart for every company who's using open source at scale to be contributing. And through that contribution, they start to have influence, they start to participate in communities, business communities, and they might be able to help with their own business by influencing features and things. So I think what we see today in a digitalized world is that every business is using open source. 70 to 85% of stacks, depending on the stats that you look at, are open source software. Open source software builds up the majority of the stacks. So any business that has any sense these days is really part of the game.
Yeah, and
so
that, oh, sorry, can I just add to that? So VMware, one of the things we look at this as the way that we can innovate, right? So we don't need to build another Kubernetes. We use these platforms that are already out there, particularly in the cloud native space, and then we build our products on top of them, and it allows us to build things that are more innovative than if we were focusing on, building everything from the ground up ourselves. And so these are important components in our product stack. And we really do see this as the way that we can innovate, but not just innovate at VMware, but innovate with the entire ecosystem in a collaborative fashion.
So I think there's lots of reasons why companies get involved in open source, but perhaps we should turn to the main topic for today, which is how can people generate revenue in relation to these open source technologies? And I think something I want to say very kind of clearly in relation to this is you cannot sell the software that you're giving away. You have to sell something else that adds value over and above that. But there are plenty of ways that you can add value to open source. One term we hear a lot is open core. Amanda, maybe you'd like to give us your definition of open core.
Yeah, and I'll try not to talk for too long because I could do the whole session on this, and I know all the panelists are the same. So I think the first thing to say before we even get to open core is that open source isn't a business model. And I think all of our panelists are going to agree that, it's a licensing methodology, it's a development methodology, it's a community building, it's a socio-political movement, it's all sorts of different things. But the one thing we'll all agree on is it's not a business model. So what you have to do is bring a business model to that. I think open core is probably one of the most popular, and it always has been since we started researching around businesses and open source. And to me, it's where your core business is built on an open source product. You probably have a community of sorts, whether they're employed by you or they're third parties, and you are distributing an open source product critical to your business, but you're making money on other add-on products that you sell. Now, Adam Jacob, the former founder of Chef, talks about tight and loose open core. And for him, tight open core is where it's very much driven by a business. And the business decisions are what are critical to that open source project. And it likely won't have a community that's made up of people beyond the company, or there'll be very few. It won't be at scale. And then you talk about loose open core, which is a slightly different slant, where it's the same kind of model, open source at its heart, with products around it, maybe more like HashiCorp. And in that kind of instance, you see that there's a really strong, vibrant community that really matters, and the decisions made are not all about the business.
Lorna, do you want to jump in on this?
I think there's something there that for open source projects as well as the open core ones, and it's something I call single vendor open source, where, like Amanda says, all of the contributors, or most of them, are all employed by the same person, or the same company, so we're really pushing in one direction. And I think that's a risk to us, to have dependencies that are essentially not community controlled or not actively contributed and maintained, but instead are really just being strongly driven by a single organization.
I think that's such an important point at the CNCF, where, for those who don't know, the CNCF will adopt community projects to bring them into neutral ownership, so they're not just owned by and controlled by a single vendor. Not that the single vendor model is necessarily, it's not a bad thing for all projects, but some of the risks might be, if that vendor gets acquired, what happens to the project? If the vendor goes out of business, what happens to the project? Making sure that if users are going to rely on a project, that there's a, let's say, a contingency plan for what's going to happen to that project, and make sure that it has sustainability going forward. And Dawn, I think VMware have a kind of slightly different approach to this, right? The extensibility.
Yeah, absolutely. We really don't embrace the open core model. I'll just say that from the beginning. What we do is something that we refer to more as open extensibility. So the idea behind that is that we build our open source projects, that we build our commercial products on top of, so things like Tanzu Community Edition, and we build those in ways that they can be extended into proprietary offerings, but not just by us, by anybody. So this requires actually taking a really thoughtful approach to how you build open source projects from the beginning, so they can be extended and used by multiple people. Because what we and none of our customers want this either. We don't really want people to feel locked in. We want them to use VMware technologies because they get, great support, or, they like us, or, it's beneficial for them. We don't want customers to use us because they feel locked into using us. So we try to make sure that our open source projects are extensible. And getting back to what Liz said, the other thing that we do with a lot of our open source projects is once they start to get some traction from other companies and we're getting more contributors and more adopters, we often contribute those to places like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Apache, other software foundations, the Linux Foundation, because we think that this neutral governance is important for projects that are getting a lot of traction. So we don't donate everything that we do to foundations, but we do where we think it makes sense.
That's great. So I guess if we come back to where's the revenue coming for these kind of open core family of models, it's starting from the open source code and then having some additional features or some additional capabilities that are proprietary and you charge money for them. Would that be a fair summary? What other ways can we think of for business models? I think something that we often hear about is something as a service, software as a service, platform as a service. How does that relate to the open source model? Who wants to jump in on that?
I'll jump in. I think the as a service model is really interesting because, of course, open source is something that you can take and use, and that's part of the point, is that you have the freedom to do that. You might not want to operate some of those open source platforms yourself. So that's where the service part comes in. Ivan is databases as a service. And unless your core business is operating Kafka, you probably want to outsource that somewhere. And it's really nice to have, there are a bunch of operators in this space. So we're not open core, we only run thoroughly open source things. So all of our customers can take their stuff on-prem or to a competitor tomorrow, which I think is something that is sometimes a new idea to some of the business people that we work with, but actually our churn rates are pretty low. It's a you're paying for the convenience, for the service, for the reliability, and people find that it's worth it to their business.
Sorry, go ahead, Dawn. Yeah,
I was gonna say it's a big part of our business as well. So people can, as we move more into the cloud native space and we move to solutions that can be delivered across multi-clouds, the software as a service model becomes really important, because I don't know, most companies are not going to run their own, from Kubernetes all the way up to how they deliver applications. It's just a lot of work for a lot of companies. And by being able to do that as a service, we can more quickly deliver, security fixes. We can help people in ways that we can't do if they're running it, privately on premise. And so while we certainly, people can do that with all of our products, we're trying to move to more of a software as a service model as a company as we start to move into more of the multi-cloud, cloud native space.
I think that point about security updates is a really great example of why people don't necessarily want to manage software themselves, or why it's valuable to them to have somebody else take care of security patches, take care of updates, take care of, just keeping the wheels turning, because that's, very rarely completely effort free. Amanda, we've got, I think, a comment here about how open source works. A comment from, I'm not sure whether this is pronounced Jorge or George, but a conference about understanding how open source works. So I wonder if there's any other additional points you want to make about what we mean by open source, to just clarify that.
Sure. And I think that's actually quite critical to this whole discussion around business models and what is an open source business. And certainly a year ago, when we saw Elastic doubling down on open for the second time by shifting away from open source to a proprietary model, i.e. not doubling down on open, there was a lot of discussion about this. And the discussion was really around what is open source. And at its heart, open source is software that's distributed in a license that complies with the open source definition. And that's a very simplistic definition, but it's easy to work with. And that means that you're looking at the open source definition, which has 10 points, and those 10 points are met, those 10 requirements are met in any license that the OSI has approved. So for me, to keep it really simple, I would say that the smartest way to look at it is always to look for an OSI approved license, which you know will be OSD compliant. And the issue we saw with Elastic was that they had a license, the SSPL that they put forward. There was clearly an issue with at least one of the definitions, and they pulled it. They took it away. That was actually a Mongo license, not an Elastic license, but Elastic shifted to the license that Mongo had created. And I think when you look at what open source is and you understand that definition, how do you make money? And I spent years of my life in Canonical trying to work this out with a team of people. And there was a report in 2008, just after I joined Canonical, by a guy called Matt Aslett at 451. It's an agency that doesn't exist anymore. And back then, I think he identified 6 to 8 ways. It wasn't called open core, but it was clear that open core was the most popular. And amongst the other ways you can make money, you've got support and you've got subscription. And we've seen Red Hat subscription model worked really well for them. They're in a fairly unique position. So who knows where, how many other companies are going to work on that model. And the unique position is that they're so close to the Linux kernel. But they were able to create the subscription model and roll into it things like security, like an indemnity that would protect against legal liabilities. And I think it all comes down to how they release the sort of sanitized code. And for some people, that would be the definition of enterprise rather than subscription. When you get enterprise software, you're going to be getting those fixes, those security fixes and bug fixes with it. But then other organizations won't necessarily provide that, and they'll sell you support and other add-on services. So I think it's a really interesting piece. And of course, security is like top of everybody's agenda right now with what we've seen in the last 6 months.
I think support and let's say security support is a really important part of what people are looking for. If as a customer grows, maybe a customer starts using an open source project when it's very small and it's trying to do things in as cheap a way as possible. But at a certain point, those companies, those customers grow and they start realizing they need support and they want more. Perhaps they want more management, or they want SLAs. Flor has just mentioned that service level agreements. So as your customers increase in size, increasingly, in my experience, they actually want somebody who's on the hook, who they can pick up a phone to or raise an issue with and know that issue will be addressed within a certain period of time, which is obviously not something that necessarily happens just in an open source project.
I think, Liz, if I can just come back on that as well, from my days at Canonical, I suppose I'm a bit of an old timer now, and a decade ago we were trying to market and sell open source to people. Now open source is the norm. I put that down partly to Linus Torvalds creating Git and the sort of GitHub environment and the way that now the developer rules in an organization. You're in a digitalized world and the developer is able to go and take software they want to use without going through that legal and procurement and finance barrier. And they don't actually have to deal with, annoying lawyers like me until they get to the stage of wanting to buy those support and subscription services. It's very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Dawn, would you have anything to sort of add around this idea of support and SLAs?
I mean, I think it is important, and it is something that a lot of customers look for, because this is one of the reasons that people embrace a vendor around their open source solutions, right? Because they don't want to have to do it themselves. They don't want to have to be accountable. They don't want to have to keep track of every single security fix that they're going to need to update as patches come out. And so I think it's something that's really important to a lot of customers, is to have somebody who is more experienced with those open source projects to be able to do that for them. And I think it's an important component of doing business and reducing your business risk by not trying to do something that maybe your employees aren't really qualified to do, but just having somebody who does this all the time for lots of customers do it for you.
I guess if we turn to thinking about founders who are, thinking of or have already set up a business, I certainly see a lot of VC expectations around recurring revenue. And I think something like subscription services or support services that are recurring charges can really help with that revenue model that investors are looking for, that it's not a one-off fee. They're looking for what they call ARR, annual recurring revenue. Is that something that any of you see in your kind of day-to-day experiences? Do you see people looking for that ARR? Lorna, you're nodding.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're an as a service company, so we're very much around looking at we have a free trial, which I think is essential for any of those as a service things. Developers expect it. They expect to kick the tires. We don't really expect everybody to convert. It's great. They'll come back when they've got a real project. It's fine. But then we look at how those, as a business, we look at how those things grow. And it's a little bit more like monthly recurring revenue, because we have quite a lot of customers who grow quite quickly. So the numbers change every month. And because, we're growing a lot, so it changes a lot sort of through the year. But it is one of our big drivers, and we look at that and we look at which of our services are getting a lot of engagement. And one thing I really enjoy is looking at how an individual customer then has grown, either by adopting more cool things on our platform or because their business is being more successful on our platform. But I think it's a really important thing for us, the way that we think about our growth and our trajectory, is to see how those numbers change over time.
You make a great point about self-service and the frictionless. That idea that people can just use open source software, or they can sign up for a free trial and they can get familiar with something before they have to make some kind of financial commitment. And I guess that changes very much what the sort of sales model looks like. It's no longer, you have to pay up front, which I think that's a positive change.
I think it's a really good thing. And like Amanda says, we don't need to do the dance with the procurement. We don't need to make a big multi-year commitment. Somebody tries the free trial, looks pretty good. It's got the extensions that we need. It can scale what we need. We build the proof of concept. Maybe it's soft live for a while, and then we make a decision. And if something changes in the future, then you choose differently. You haven't bought a whole rack of hardware that you've got to explain to finance why you don't want it anymore. So it makes we're back to the innovation piece, that it lets us all move quite quickly.
Dawn, you're nodding there, and I'm wondering how that extensibility model that you talked about kind of feeds into the business model of people who want customizations and extensions.
I was actually going to make a slightly different point.
Okay.
Because the other thing I think that founders should be thinking about is the mix of kind of services and support to product, because that's another thing that I think investors look at. But I also think it's important to build as you build a sustainable company, you can't easily scale an entire services business, right? It's really hard, because if you're entirely based on service, you can only deliver so much before you need to be continually hiring more people, and hiring in this environment is pretty challenging. And so I think finding the right mix of product and maybe software as a service, which is more, as much about the software as it is about the service, I think is something that's important for founders to think about as they're thinking about business models.
Yeah, I think that is a really great point. I mean, we see a lot of businesses starting as, perhaps consultants, sort of service agencies to help people adopt open source technology. But the thing that seems to really help them take off is when they have some product element as well. There's, like you say, services businesses are kind of, the scaling is limited by the number of people you have. Whereas if you have a product, the product can have a life of its own and scale in its own, kind of independently of the number of employees you have. Amanda, what have you seen in kind of open source businesses focusing on product as opposed to services and support?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I am a real fan of a podcast called Open Source Underdogs. And there's lots and lots of founders who do brilliant half-hour, 40-minute chats with Mike Schwartz on it. And there's one that Shannon Williams does on Rancher, pre-sale to SUSE, which is really good. And he sort of says everybody tells you support doesn't scale, but they successfully scaled at Rancher. And there are ways of doing it. I think what Lorna was saying before about multi-product vendors. So products not having a single vendor is one thing, but what we're increasingly seeing is that product vendors will also support their competitors. So if you look at someone like Percona, they won't just do their own products, they'll do their competitors' products within the support bundle as well. And I think that's a really interesting shift to see. One of the things that you're making me think about, particularly when we're talking to founders, is what if? So when you start this, and again, there's another Armin, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Armin Dajker at HashiCorp did one of these interviews on Open Source Underdogs. And he talks about how they were a true community project and they built a community project without thinking at all about business models. And I know on some of the earlier sessions that I've listened to in the Founders Forum, and the Future Founders program, some of the founders will say, just build, just go in and build your product, look at the specification, make something great. And of course, you have the potential to get ubiquity. You have the potential to become the de facto standard. You've got incredible potential because of GitHub, because of GitLab, because of that ability to adopt in a digitalized economy. But you're still going to have to work a business model. And I've seen where you have a great product that everybody wants to use, but nobody wants to pay for. So maybe I'm being too conservative, maybe I'm being an old lawyer about this, but I have this sort of what if theory. What if you build something and someone else takes it? And most people are kind of cool with that. What if you build something, somebody else takes it and makes money out of it? And that becomes more difficult. What if somebody else takes it and they made shed loads of money? And you see people hurt at that stage. You know, Mark Shuttleworth on his Underdogs podcast talks about enabling your competitors with your own innovation. And he actually is a bit vulnerable there, and he says it's financially and emotionally draining. And that's really tough, right? And I think that means that you probably should, even if you're just at the product development, product evolution stage, be thinking about how am I going to do this? And what we're seeing is open core and the SaaS models being the ones that really seem to work best, at least for now.
Lorna, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, I can. I think there's something there as well about being at risk of your competitors doing something with your work, but then also being open to your competitors doing something with your work. At Ivan, we've just had a lovely contribution from an immediate direct competitor who depends on one of our open source things that we published because we needed it. Something went closed source, we did an alternative, they use it. We all kind of need this feature, they built it first, now we've both got it. So I think it can work both ways, but it has to be quite an even relationship, because if you feel, and I think Elastic felt this way, that they were doing all of the work and not necessarily getting the biggest slice of the pie. And if you have investors, if you're not a community open source project, that is super hard. And that's when you need to change your plan.
So what can we learn? What can we take away from that Elastic episode, do you think? Anyone?
I think one of the things that we've taken away from that is that and it's something that I'd been evangelizing quite a bit internally within VMware, is trying to get people to think about the risks that they're taking when they embrace these single vendor open source projects, even multi-vendor open source projects that are owned by a single vendor. And it's something that I think we need to pay more attention to. And so I'm trying to get our engineers to think about that before they incorporate these things into our products. And then when something happens, like a license change to a license that our customers don't accept, then we need to, figure out what to do with that. And it puts us in a really difficult business position. But the more engaged we are upstream in these projects, the better we'll be at anticipating these situations. Because if we're in those communities and if we're talking to those people, the chances of us getting some insight into the problems earlier, I think would help a lot. We were surprised by the Elastic thing. Maybe in retrospect, maybe we shouldn't have been. But I think that it's so easy to incorporate these open source technologies into our products, and engineers don't always think about the potential ramifications of doing so and the risks that we're taking as a business.
Yeah, I think that there's a set of things that you are legally allowed to do, but that may not be perceived as the correct thing to do, and that can make the community react in a way that, well, either is unexpected or perhaps could have been thought of or anticipated if people had gone through that what if exercise. Amanda, do you want to add anything around that?
Oh, there's so much to add to that. I mean, we have so many points in there. I mean, one that's really great is for businesses, not necessarily the founders we're talking to today, to try and start to understand how open source works as they're adopting at scale so that they can be part of those communities and have that good governance, because it's critical. And something that immediately comes to mind that I know Lorna will want to talk about is the power of the fork. And I think that's one of the critical things about open source is it's fine for someone to shift. And, Elastic technically, legally weren't doing anything wrong. I believe that, AWS weren't doing anything wrong in using Elastic software. It was open source, it was free to use. And Elastic shift, again, it's maybe a moral thing, but legally they didn't do anything wrong in moving licenses. But the open communities and the users of that code have the benefit of the ability to fork and be able to continue to use the existing code open source irrespective of that. And I know Lorna will jump in on that. I think that the thing that comes from me from sort of Elastic and the comments that we've seen Mongo's CEO make, where they talk about open source being a marketing tool. And that ubiquity that you can create in open source, you just can't do it in proprietary. You're encumbered by royalties and contracts that have to be negotiated or put in place. And that ability to get straight into an organization as an open source founder, to get your product in there, that's your winning strategy. That's your base point that you have to use. And you have to work out where you're going to go from there. And if you want to have true open source, if you want to have something that will not have the controversy that Elastic's had, you can't be doing that on the basis that you're going to have to shift to a proprietary model later. And if we look at Elastic, my understanding at least is they were making a lot of money. They were doing really well, but they wanted more. And the story is that they wanted more because they were being pressured by investors. It could also just be that they see so much money associated with their products and that they want a bigger slice. And you can understand that too, but it does go back to the what if. And I don't think you should open source if you're not comfortable with it. The other side of Mark Shuttleworth's comment is that if you decide not to enable your competitors with your own innovation, he goes on to say that you're going to be irrelevant. And I suspect that as we move forward, that will be increasingly the case, that if your software isn't open source, it is not going to be relevant anymore.
Lorna, do go ahead.
Don't let me talk too much about this.
It's okay, so, we've got 20 minutes. It's
okay. There's a hard stop. That's good news. So Ivan also offered Elasticsearch as a service, and Elastic obviously changed their license terms on that, and that's fine. That's their call. Any of us can fork an open source project. I think Elastic forked theirs. The difference is they own the trademark because it wasn't in any of it wasn't neutral governance. But that's the only difference. What did I learn from the Elastic license? So I've been in open source for a really long time. I've always felt, if we need to fork as a community, we will, and we'll make it work. And I had these great ideals around it. But now I've lived through the reality of forking a project and all of its dependent projects when you have no maintainers, no contributors, because Elastic weren't really taking a lot of patches from outside, especially that competed with their sort of proprietary add-ons that were previously in the open source Elastic. Like, to do all of that from no previous community was wild. And I feel like I learned a lot. I think OpenSearch, it's the beginning of the story, right? It still doesn't have neutral governance, but still aspires to. We know we have more contributors. We've had to have more maintainers because the Elastic clients don't work with OpenSearch either. So that's a whole new set of projects. But when I think about this and I think about the risks, probably you've seen, and if you haven't, somebody can post it in the chat, the XKCD showing open source with like one little vulnerable bit, which is like maintained by one person in an obscure place by themselves, has been doing it for years. That's one of the risks, but some of the risks look quite different, and they are those single vendor projects. And what would you do if one of those projects went away, and how important is that to your business model? Not to say that you shouldn't use it or that it shouldn't be part of your story, but I think understanding where you are is really important to every business. Thank you, Flor. There is the link in the chat.
Wonderful.
I think
Dawn,
just
I'm
to,
sure.
just to add to that, I think one of the things that's important to think about when we think about forks is that the ones historically that have been successful are the ones where they've actually forked the contributor community. So if you think about LibreOffice forking from OpenOffice, I think most of us would agree that LibreOffice became much more successful than the original OpenOffice, but it's because the community went with the fork and the developers, the contributors went with the fork. And so I think it's going to be hard, I'll be honest, for AWS to be successful with OpenSearch, because they forked Elasticsearch and Kibana, but they didn't get any of the contributors because those people were all employed by Elastic because they didn't have an external contributor community. So that fork being successful is going to be really challenging for all of the reasons that Lorna just described. It's an awful lot of work to fork a project. And if you don't have a lot of the contributors and the community going with you, then it's a lot more difficult to become successful.
Can I add something, Liz? Sorry. I was just going to jump in and say that what Don's saying there, I think, is absolutely critical. And I think for any founders who are looking to set up an open source business, increasingly as your users become more savvy and as time goes by, people are not going to want to use and make integral to their business code which doesn't have a community around it. If it's open source, they're going to want to see a community. And that is a message that they're going to hear more and more and more at conferences as they start to engage with open source, as they read about it, that you have to make sure in your sanity checking, as well as looking at the license and the good governance, that there is a real community there and that it's not just a company using this as a marketing tool.
Yeah, I think, for founders who have an open source project, there's a couple of different elements that I would want to add to that conversation. One is you probably have most of the expertise. There's any number of projects where there's 1 or 2 or 10 or however many people who've been with that project since the beginning, and they're the real experts in it. And it's really important to think about how they're involved in that project and how that expertise can be, well, from a founder's point of view, that's an advantage. If you have that expertise, perhaps you can leverage that as part of your support model, for example. But also thinking about how you can make sure that there is a community and that there isn't that sense of dependency on one vendor. And I think that's one of the reasons why foundations are attractive for startups. At one level, they're thinking, oh, this is free marketing, which I'm not sure that's quite the right way to think about it. But the other level is you have taken away that risk that Amanda was just talking about, that companies perceive you as a risk, that they don't necessarily want the dependency on you as a single vendor. Getting some good comments actually coming in from the audience. So Alex said this is an interesting, important and useful conversation. Understanding your dependencies is so important. That's a comment from Floor. And Sammy saying, and I think this is a very good point, it's essential to monitor the evolving technology and the market you're targeting, as the parameters change over time and the founder's original assumptions will become invalid. I think that's a really interesting point. Amanda, you sort of look like you might have something to add.
Always got something to add. No, I think this is really fascinating. And I think that looking more at governance is going to be important for projects. And one of the things that we've been talking about as well in this founders work is that the UK is brilliant at producing engineers, right? So when you're looking at your revenue models, it's likely that you've got a group of engineers together because you're developing this as a project and then a product and then a business. And I think we've got Mike from Buddy Base in Belfast joining next week, who is, I think he's just taken his second round of funding. So it'll be quite interesting to see how the conversation shifts when they start to talk about this. But I think it's really important to find people who understand the revenue generation and your governance practices at that early stage, even if you're not bringing them on board into your team full time, to have people. And again, the mentoring that we're offering may also be part of that kind of thing. But find people who've been through this already, because there's a lot of learned experience. And the nature of people who do this is that they want to contribute and they want to share. So they'll likely share with you and help you with your business, I think.
And in fact, that's one of the, I guess, motivations behind the Founders Forum, right? I think there was a large group of people involved with Open UK who want to encourage those businesses, partly because we think we have expertise that maybe could be useful. So if you're out there as a founder, we are genuinely enthusiastic to try and help. Dawn, you also look like you had more to throw in to that discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other things that founders should really be thinking hard about as you put together your offerings, whether it's software as a service or product or services, is where those components are coming from and what the risk to your business could be. Because if you think about something like incorporating a technology that then gets relicensed, a company like VMware, we have loads of software developers and we can probably absorb that change. But if you're a small startup with a handful of engineers and something big happens to a component that your product is relying on, what are you going to do and how are you going to manage those risks? And I think it's something that's worth spending some time thinking about as you're putting things together so that you're not caught off guard by it. Now, we can't anticipate everything, right? Like the Log4j thing kind of came at us from the side. I don't think any of us anticipated those kinds of security vulnerabilities. But the more you can think about the risks that you might be taking and how you might mitigate them, I think it'll help a lot with becoming successful over the long term and not getting derailed while you're still quite small.
I think there's so much focus largely coming from that security angle around tracking dependencies, understanding the software supply chain, and that's going to help people understanding their licensing risks as well, and their the potential dependencies they have on components that may or may not be well maintained. I think that's historically been really quite hard for people to manage and understand, but hopefully these security tools will help us with that governance angle as well. And in fact, again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, George, or possibly Jorge, asking about how security concerns are solved when a contributor can change a library and, well, I guess potentially damage software. And I guess that is just, it's fundamentally a concern that if you have a dependency on a library, you probably know that a particular version of that library works for you, but you are reliant on it. And if someone changes that library to be insecure or buggy or something else wrong with it, yeah, this is why you need to understand your supply chain. Which I guess is slightly getting away from the revenue models, but I think all these things are kind of related. Sammy making the point, OpenChain is working on replicating the license compliance spec to create a security governance model. Currently a guide, but the hope is that it will become a spec. So that's interesting.
Liz, it might be worth just talking there. OpenChain is one of 2 ISO standards that have come out of the Linux Foundation. The other is SPDX, and SPDX relates to software bills of materials, SBOMs. And I think if you're building a business, it's going to be important for you to be able to meet requirements your customers have. And I think increasingly, again, as we see this governance become more entrenched, we're going to see OpenChain, the policies in OpenChain, there's free training around that will help you meet those policies, and SPDX and possibly other things as time goes by, becoming requirements of your code. It's great because these are standards. Back in the day, I had to deal with every vendor we distributed to wanting a different document attached, whether it was a certificate of originality or some other form of SBOM. So if you can work to meet these standards as you're building product, when you start to sell services and they want to know what your product is, it's going to be a quick win for you. So I really think, although it might not feel as a founder that these are relevant to you, that they're relevant to customers, I really think it's worth getting on top of those early stage.
Something else that we mentioned earlier in relation to Elastic was the and I think it was Lorna saying that the sort of subtleties of who had done the fork, because they owned the trademarks. So I think that maybe is an important lesson for founders. Amanda, do you want to speak about?
Yeah. So we would always tell you as lawyers to own the trademark for your organization and the trademark for any project you're creating that you think might have a significant brand. And frankly, you start with a Google search, and if you find the name in the software space in a Google search, you don't use it. Find something that doesn't come up, make it up, and get it registered. It's really hard, just a bit of legal advice that I'm not meant to give you. It's really hard to get a mark registered in the US. You have to prove that you're already using it. Europe and the UK is much easier. So if you've got an affiliation here, start here, and then you can start to demonstrate that course of usage as time goes by. But whatever has been settled between AWS and Elastic, and none of us seem to know, that's come out of the power of owning that mark. And it's normal for open source to have those marks. There's a woman called Pam Chestick who has been on the OSI board, who's got sampled trademark agreements and things that you can take, trademark licenses you can take and use for open source projects. Mozilla's has always been good as well.
Yeah, Sammy saying Firefox is a good example. So presumably that's Mozilla. Yeah. All right, we are getting close-ish to the end of the hour. So I wonder if I'll go around the panel and ask if there are any other points you would like to bring up. We have only got 7 minutes though, so don't get carried away. Dawn, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think this has been a really, really interesting discussion. And I think that there are so many different ways that you can make revenue out of open source solutions that it's a really important thing for founders to be thinking about early on before you've really kind of gotten started, but thinking about how you are going to monetize it. Because the bit that's really important is that how you decide to build your commercial business or how you decide to monetize the work that you're doing has a real impact on how people see you and what you can do in the future. So, if you look at, these single vendor open source projects that then do something like change the license, that's probably not going to win you any points with the open source community. And so you need to think about the impact of the decisions that you're making, especially if you're a small company, and think about how it's going to influence how you can build your business over time, and take a strategic look at the revenue models and how you're working in open source and how you can continue to be a good open source citizen and build your business and build a good brand and good reputation around your startup, and think about how that's going to serve you over the long term with a strategic look at the future.
Lorna, what would you like to add?
Predictably, I am mostly going to echo Dawn. I think if you're going to operate in the open source space, it's really important that you understand the formal expectations of open source, but also the informal ones. Hacker culture is rich and baffling. And I think it's very important to have a good relationship with your community, to understand them and to communicate with them. I'm completely biased, right? Because I work in developer relations, literally what I do. But I think it is important to have not only developer aware communications to the outside world and the things that your consumers expect from you, like the SBOM that we talked about, but also to have good understanding inside the business. Rely on the wisdom of open source, either by hiring or by getting advisors that can help you navigate this space, because there's a lot there, and it can be really strange as a founder to be open to some of the things that are normal. It's like a different culture. But there's a lot here. Make sure you've got a good guide.
Amanda, what would you like to close with?
Yeah, without repeating what everybody else is saying, I think when you get into open source, you're going in the right direction. So if you want to be in a software business in future, it's going to have to be open source. So as you build out what you're doing, think about your business model, but think about where you can access resources that will help you beyond your personal core skill set. And organizations like ours are just sitting here waiting to help you. We want to see you be successful. We want to help build more startups and to see founders evolve businesses in the UK without feeling that they have to move to the Bay Area because they need funding or because they need skills and resources. There's a surprising leadership. You can see some of the people on this call today and in the other sessions. There's a surprising hub of leadership around open technologies here in the UK right now. And there's lots of people who will help you and have an array of skills if you need that support. I think I would encourage you to ask questions and reach out and use those free resources and the people who will help you.
That's wonderful. So I think it just remains really for me to say a massive thank you to the wonderful panel. I think today we've had some really fascinating points raised, really good discussion. Next week, it will be session 6. It's going to be about raising finance and managing your runway for an open technology business. So I believe it's the same time next week on Friday. May has posted a sign-up link, and I'm sure you'll also find that sign-up link on the Open UK website. Do get in touch with Open UK if you have any questions, queries, interest in the mentoring plan, either as a founder or as someone with expertise that you'd like to share. We would love to hear from you. Did I forget anything, Amanda? Okay, wonderful. So massive round of applause virtually for my wonderful panelists, Dawn, Lorna and Amanda. And I'm Liz. And we'll see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.